Well, good afternoon, North American Energy News readers. We're happy to welcome Bernadette Johnson from Drillinginfo today. Welcome, Bernadette.
Thank you so much for having me.
What we're going to be talking about today is a new report released by Drillinginfo, and I believe Bernadette is the lead author. And it's all about the Permian Basin midstream and basically the infrastructure, whether or not it's adequate to handle the coming expansion that as prices rise, and what needs to be built out and where it needs to be built out. So, Bernadette, maybe we can start off with you giving us an overview of the report, and then we'll talk about some of the aspects of the report.
Sure. So my team is a market intelligence team. So we focus on basically supply demand, what's happening in these different basins, what's happening with infrastructure, and what it means for future production and future pricing. So this report, we focused on the Permian midstream. So meaning transportation infrastructure to actually move the oil and the gas. Once we produce it, how do we move it out? How do we move it out of West Texas to the areas where we actually need it? The big takeaway for the report is the Permian is certainly the hot basin right now. Even if you're not in energy, but you're tracking the news, you can see that. A lot of big transactions taking place, a lot of drilling activity ramping up, a lot of big operators basically kind of placing their stake in the Permian and saying that's their growth area. As a result of that, we have to look downstream. We have to look midstream, downstream. We have to look at, is the infrastructure in place sufficient to move this volume out? If not, where do we need to put in infrastructure? What is the timeline of that? Are there periods of time where there might be bottlenecks? And the short answer is, given the activity, given the growth that we're anticipating, we're going to need more of everything. We're going to need more crude pipeline takeaway, more gas pipeline takeaway. Out 4 or 5 years, we'll also need additional processing capacity. So this is definitely a hot basin, growing quickly, and we're going to need the infrastructure to support that.
Terrific. Well, let's talk about oil takeaway to begin. And my understanding from reading the press release was that the infrastructure within the Midland part of the Midland Basin is probably adequate in the short term. But once you get out of there into the Delaware, particularly the South Delaware, it's not as good. Is that a fair reading of the report?
That's fair. It's definitely fair. And I think the big takeaway there is we talk about the Permian as one basin, but it's actually several basins. It's a huge area geographically. So you have your Midland, which is more east. You have your Delaware, which is Texas and New Mexico. It's more of the western piece. And in the middle, you have your Central Basin platform. You have different plays that are scattered throughout, different infrastructure, different pipelines that handle each of these areas. The Midland in general is where we initially started focusing our attention when we went into the Permian with horizontal drilling, unconventional technology. We started in the Midland. And the Midland has always been a little more or a little better connected to the rest of the country because that's where a lot of activity historically has also been focused. So the Midland is the further east part. It's definitely better connected. You move over to the Delaware. The Delaware is not. So not as many pipelines, not as well connected even to the Midland to get you access to those pipelines. And the Delaware is also the area where we actually see the most ramp up right now. So some of you might have seen the Alpine High new play announcement from Apache. It's a pretty big deal, potentially a very large gas play. Also produces a fair amount of oil and liquids. And that area today is not well connected to the infrastructure grid at all. So when we look to the future, that is definitely an area that stands out where we are going to need more pipelines and more infrastructure in place.
Now, I remember we did some stories on the Alpine High when it was announced, and the 20 billion barrels of oil. I forget how much gas, but it was a considerable amount of gas. I think 5 or 6 trillion cubic feet, if I remember correctly. But one of the points that was made is that the Alpine High would not be as economic and would not build out as quickly as people maybe thought, because of that lack of infrastructure. So has that analysis changed? Are the higher prices now drawing, say, like Apache? Are they now looking at drilling there and maybe a little quicker than they had originally anticipated?
So I would say the short answer to that is no. and definitely the holdup will be infrastructure. So if you look at that area, it's more southern Delaware. So even within the Delaware, there are some areas that are better connected than others. The southern Delaware stands out as a place that lacks a lot of significant infrastructure. Now the Alpine High is potentially a very large gas play. Now we only have preliminary information for Apache. They've drilled something like 17 wells, only actually produced from 8 of those wells, or currently producing from 8, because of the infrastructure. Because you can't bring a well online if you can't do something with the commodity. And so today we only have 17 wells in our sample, 8 wells are actually producing. The holdup is infrastructure. Now the size of those wells becomes meaningful because they're big. 8,500 a day, 8,500 MCF a day initial gas production rate, about 175 barrels a day initial crude production rate. These are big wells. These are wells that compete and are in line with the size of Marcellus wells or some Utica wells. So they're very big wells, which means we need infrastructure to move it. And today we know that they're not ramping up more quickly and they're not even running all of those wells that they drilled because they're lacking pipelines. Now, I think we have started to see some movement. There's some midstream players down in that area looking at putting in assets. I think some of the delay will definitely be it's an area that's going to take time to build out. There's not a lot you can add on to quickly. It's going to be a lot of greenfield projects. We also look at pricing and what's happening with gas prices, what's happening with crude prices. Gas prices bumped up to $4 a few weeks ago. Now they're back down around the $3.20 mark. That kind of volatility in prices makes it really hard to make long-term capital commitments and invest in these big pipelines that have to happen. So if anything, today's price fluctuation is maybe delaying it a bit more than normal, but we do anticipate that if that play turns out to be as prolific as the initial results show, that we will build infrastructure. The midstream guys will get out there, they'll get active, they'll put pipe in the ground, and they'll start to move that volume. Just not going to happen overnight. Okay.
One question for you, Bernadette, because I should know this, but I don't. Which regulator regulates pipeline construction and approvals within the state of Texas? So if we're going from the Permian, say, up to Houston or some other processing plant within Texas, is that the Railroad Commission or is it a FERC decision?
It's mainly the Railroad Commission. So FERC will have some jurisdiction on intrastate. So intrastate means within the same state, so within Texas. Railroad Commission has the majority of jurisdiction over anything that happens within Texas. There's a few examples where you might have FERC, some of the storage fields in Texas, for instance, FERC oversees. But by and large, if we're talking about new pipe, new processing, it's going to go through the Railroad Commission.
And the reason I asked, of course, is because there's been a little bit of chaos, I guess, over at FERC with a couple of members, board members resigning, and they can't even have a quorum. And so I wondered if that would be a constraining factor, but it doesn't sound like it. And the Railroad Commission, of course, we interviewed a number of their commissioners. Railroad Commission seems to be pretty well organized on this front. Okay, so from the time that, how long will it take, say, if there's an application to get a pipeline built, how long does it take for the Railroad Commission to approve it?
So it depends, of course, on how big the pipeline is, how long it is. If we're talking about building a pipe all the way from the Permian over to the Gulf Coast, for instance, the full span over to Houston or Corpus Christi, we're probably talking at least 18 months minimum. We're probably stretching to 24 months. The type of pipes that we would be proposing are pretty big. Generally, there's environmental things to take into account. There's certain hunting seasons along the way that we have to be conscious of in terms of construction schedules. But generally, 18 to 24 months, you can have a pretty significant size pipeline from when you first kind of float the idea to when you actually have in service.
Oh, so that's just float the idea, get the approval, build it, in service, 18 to 24 months.
Yes, and it's quicker definitely in Texas than it would be in many other places in the country. And it's quicker than if you do have to go through the FERC because you're crossing state borders or something. It's definitely quicker. The seasonal component and the seasonal weather in Texas also helps. You're not talking about trying to build pipeline in the thick of winter where it's snowing outside or the ground is frozen. So those things make it easier. So Texas is definitely easier than anywhere else.
Is there any chance that some of that gas or oil will, from the Delaware, will go up, say, northwest into New Mexico or someplace where FERC might have approval?
It could. I think there's a lot of actual existing interstate pipelines that already exist in the northern part of the Delaware. So that Texas, New Mexico area, there are several pipelines. Like Transwestern stands out, El Paso, the big Kinder Morgan pipeline stands out. Some of those do move up into New Mexico and then over to California and the coast. They're pretty much bottlenecked. There is an existing path. You could potentially expand some of those, although that would be difficult. The question, I think, really comes down to where will we need more gas? And for us, we look at demand, we look at everything that's changing. Power demand is growing, LNG exports are growing, exports to Mexico are growing. The more likely path for that gas is probably east and south. So south to Mexico, east to the Gulf Coast for LNG exports, or to meet growing power demand. There's not a ton of demand growing in California or west. So do we need additional pipes that head that way? Probably not. Some of that gas might find its way there, but not large quantities. I would say it's more likely to head east or south.
Okay, so if it's heading east and it's going to the coast, what's the likelihood that this is going to have an impact on LNG plants? And we're seeing that there are a number. We've seen Sabine Pass from I've forgotten the company name, but so that big processing plant. But there are a number of others that are in the FERC approval process. So does this quantity of gas now being available maybe to come to market, does that impact LNG development on the coast?
I think it could. I think in general more. So I think it's a little bit the opposite. This gas is going to need to find a home, and it could definitely find a home at LNG. It's one of the options that is available for producers in the Permian. And it makes a lot of sense given where they are and the quantity that we're talking about. Is it going to be LNG terminals that can happen only because this gas shows up? Probably not. So we're still in a demand-constrained market. LNG terminals will get built. Cheniere's Sabine Pass is running today at 2.2 BCF a day. They're ramping up that third train actually more quickly than was originally anticipated. So they are definitely kind of hit the ground running. There's a few other projects that are already under construction. Those are definitely going to happen. There's 18 to 20 total proposed. Many of those will get done. Many of them won't. And a lot of what may not get done is really going to be because the global LNG market can't necessarily support 20. The global LNG market, it's a 33 to 34 BCF a day market, the global import side. So we today, just the facilities that are under construction today, we could send out almost 9 BCF a day of gas. So can you send out 9 BCF a day of gas into a 34 BCF a day import market? That's going to be a tall order. So do we need all these terminals? Probably not, but many of them will happen. Some of the ones that were later to the game might get pushed out or may not happen till later. Definitely Permian will find a home at some of those terminals. The Gulf Coast, Texas is generally pretty well connected, and this is a logical home for a lot of this gas to go.
Let's talk about Mexico for a minute, because of course with the Trump administration, that's top of mind for many people. And given the President Trump's concerns over the NAFTA agreement with Mexico, that sort of raises the question of whether or not the imports of American natural gas might be affected. What's your take on that?
So today we send out about 4.1 BCF a day of gas to Mexico from the U.S. We track what Mexico is saying pretty closely. The plan for them in 2017 is actually to pull more gas from the U.S., not take the LNG cargoes, the few cargoes they took last year, and source nearly all of their gas supply from the U.S. Now that was the plan before the administration changes and before some of these things like the border adjustment tax or renegotiating NAFTA started to come into play. I would say in general, we are the vast majority of the supply that hits Mexico, and that's going to continue. The way that it's connected to the grid, all the different pipelines that connect to different pipelines in Mexico, the grid is set up for us to move a lot of supply, and Mexico couldn't replace that overnight. But that being said, if we do implement something like a border adjustment tax to maybe the crude barrels that we're bringing in from Mexico right now, is there the potential that they might implement some kind of tax on their side for the gas volumes that are heading across the border, there is. So I think those risks certainly are more significant today than they were a month ago. But in general, the markets work very well, and the grid is connected in such a way that we need to continue to send that gas. They need to continue to import it to meet all the growing power demand that they have. And that's not going to go away overnight. It might get a little bit more tricky, definitely, but we're anticipating that by and large that 4 BCF and even more is going to continue to happen. We're going to work through NAFTA. We're going to work through how that process unfolds related to the BAT for our key trade partners like Mexico and Canada. And a lot of the kind of early heartburn about it, we're going to sort that out. That's our general opinion, that we have to. These markets are interconnected. There's really no other option.
Yeah, that's something that very often gets ignored, is how the, particularly being in Canada, when we know just how integrated the Canadian and American markets are for oil and gas. And Mexico, of course, over maybe the last decade, maybe, has become much more integrated with, particularly with American producers. And so I happen to agree with you. Now, what about the potential market for more power generation? Because we've seen over the last, well, it's not even that many years, say 3 or 4 years, United States has gone from 49% of its power generation using coal down to 30%. There's a lot of pressure on companies to get rid of that last 30%. That gas is the gas plus wind in particular seems to be the logical way to do that. How does that figure into your market demand analysis?
Sure. So we track power demand for natural gas pretty closely. And because we do, we track the power demand or the power generation from renewables, from coal, from nuclear. And generally, we believe the gas demand from from power generation will continue to grow. It's going to be a large source of demand growth for natural gas in general. We track all the facilities we're building. We track the coal retirements, and all signals point to additional gas being used in the U.S. for power going forward. Gas is a logical backup for any kind of renewable, whether it's solar or wind, because gas plants can fire up very quickly. They're very efficient. We're also living in a world now where our gas prices are going to be low for the foreseeable future. We had prices up to $14 back in 2008. We haven't had a price anywhere near that except for very short periods of time because of snowstorms or something since then. We are range bound for gas prices between about $2.50 and $5, and that's not going to change. And because of that, gas is going to be competitive. We can produce a lot of gas quickly. We can move that gas all across the country to meet power demand and other demand very quickly. And it is the logical really feedstock to replace coal and to backstop any growth in renewables. So we track all of that pretty closely, and we are definitely of the opinion that gas-fired power generation is going to grow. Renewables is also going to grow. Coal is going to continue to kind of lose the battle, and it's going to be a source of demand growth for U.S. natural gas markets.
Now, what about in terms of the supply? So in the Permian Basin, if we look a little bit to the northwest, up in your part of the world, around the Rocky Mountains, of course, we've got the Manco Shale was just reassessed by the U.S. Geological Survey to 66 trillion cubic feet of reserves. So that would seem to be a supply constraint in the northwest and to the west. And then, of course, north of Texas, you've got the Utica and the Marcellus. So does that serve to constrain to some extent the market that Texas can serve?
So I think that's a great question. I would say it all comes down to economics. It all comes down to the break-even cost of production. What do you need to receive for your gas volumes over the life of the well in the Rockies versus the Northeast versus Texas? What we know is generally, if you look at that cost stack, the Rockies loses today. We do have a lot of gas out there. We know where it is. The problem is it's more expensive to produce than your Northeast, your Marcellus Utica, or than your Texas. I think another factor that really impacts that dynamic and that cost curve is the crude production you also get from Permian. So if we're talking about Permian production, drilling in the Delaware or the Midland, as crude prices come up, $60, maybe 65 or 70 eventually, it basically makes that gas that they produce alongside that crude very cheap, among the cheapest gas in the country to produce. We call that associated gas. We're drilling for the crude, but we're also getting the gas out, and it's very cheap. And that's going to happen. So that places Texas, Permian, and Eagle Ford pretty high in the stack of areas that are going to continue to see activity. These are areas that are going to drive production growth. The Northeast, Marcellus, Utica, those are gas plays, but the break-evens up there are also very low. They don't even have the liquids, a strong liquids component, but the gas break-evens are between $1 and $3 for most of that drilling up there. So they're going to win the battle. If it's all about price, you got to compete. They're going to win. Texas is definitely going to win. The Rockies is going to struggle. The Rockies, there's a lot of gas out there, but they need something more like $4 before you start to see widespread drilling again. And in a world where you've got other options, they're just not going to be high enough in the stack that you're going to see that activity come back.
One of the things that President Trump ran on during his campaign, and we've already seen him begin to address this, is reducing the amount of regulation on oil and gas producers. Is that going to have a significant impact on break-even costs for gas and oil producers in the Permian?
So we don't believe that it will. I think where you're going to see some definite changes, and this is federal again because it's coming from the administration, is federal land or maybe Gulf of Mexico. So federal land, there is a lot of federal land in the Rockies, and with the previous administration, the permitting times were pretty long. There were additional regulations that were being proposed. It made it a very difficult environment for a producer to go in and say, I'm going to develop my land that's federal. And so that in many ways gets easier. The hard part is, and that doesn't really apply to much of Texas, it does apply to New Mexico. I think the problem is it goes back to economics. Do we really need to develop that federal land large scale? We probably don't, because we have other options in the Permian, in the Eagle Ford in Texas, up in the Northeast. None of those things are really going to be impacted widely by the administration. Now, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with the EPA, with clean water, with clean air, and that could play a role. But generally, all these companies are also, they're beholden to their shareholders. And the overall push is we do want to develop these resources as cleanly and as safely as possible. And that need doesn't go away just because you have some small regulatory changes. We've gotten very efficient. We've gotten very good at producing these hydrocarbons very safely and very cleanly and reducing the carbon footprint. I think those trends are just going to continue, where we are in a world where we have to compete with renewables and other things. So that, if anything, we don't think it's going to be wide-scale change because of the feds. The only area it will really impact is the federal land.
That's a very interesting observation. I've seen a few pundits talk about how the trend towards being more efficient, more less carbon intensive is now kind of baked into the culture of the oil patch in a way that it wasn't 10 years ago. And it sounds like you agree with that. And people aren't going to make major changes in the way they operate because they see the trend, and short-term changes in regulation aren't going to produce a lot of changes in the way they operate. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. And I mean, the technology has changed. We are better at capturing some of the gas we used to flare from some of these wells. We're better at capturing that now. You also have regulations on the state level. So Colorado has kind of led the charge on capturing that additional natural gas. That's a state level rule. That doesn't change with the administration, and that's going to continue. And so once we have the technology, once we know we can make it work efficiently, there's no reason to go backwards. And especially considering we don't know what's going to happen in 4 years with the next election. We don't know what's going to happen in 8 years after a new administration comes in. And all signals are, and from the public, from shareholders, from everyone, we need to do what we do efficiently, safely, and in the best way possible. So that, if anything, that need just grows over time.
Very interesting. So we've talked about a lot of topics here. We've talked about the demand for increased gas and oil coming out of the Permian Basin. We've talked about infrastructure constraints. We've talked about where demand might be in the next few years, both in Mexico and within sort of the Permian Basin market catchment. Anything that we haven't talked about that we should talk about that would be of interest to our readers?
You know, I think that pretty much covers it. I think we focus a lot on Texas, but that's where a lot of the production is going to come from. It's where you're going to see infrastructure pop up. We do see demand growing across all these hydrocarbons. We do see prices improving across all of these natural gas, crude, and NGLs. And those, I think, are the big takeaways. We've had a period of time since prices first collapsed in 2014 where the picture looked different. Natural production in the U.S., natural gas and crude was declining in the U.S. Infrastructure projects were getting delayed or canceled, and things are definitely turning around. And Texas certainly is going to lead a lot of that.
Great. Bernadette Johnson from Drillinginfo, we really appreciate you coming and spending some time with us today. Very interesting insights. I think our readers are really going to enjoy this, and we look forward to having you back for a webinar in the near future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.